This is a video on Aurobindo's Life Divine, Book 1, Chapter 6. Good evening, this is Chris speaking. Wake up with the next video in the series of the Life Divine by Aurobindo, this time Chapter 6 of Book 1, Man and the Universe. Of course, with man, he meant mankind. Back then, 100 years ago, there was no politically correct language. Yes, it's true, it's 2021, and Aurobindo wrote this between 1914 and 1921. The last chapter we dealt with the destiny of the individual, and this chapter is about the destiny of mankind as a collective. Thank you for liking and subscribing, by the way, or joining me on Patreon. And now let's start. We have seen in the last chapter that it is the fate of humanity as individuals as well as collectively to transcend the life of suffering and to reunite with a forgotten divine absolute. This absolute, as he writes, exists as an all-revealing and all-guiding truth of things, which watches over the world and attracts mortal men, first without the knowledge of his conscious mind by the general march of nature, but at last consciously by a progressive awakening and self-enlargement to his divine ascension. The ascent of the divine life is the human journey, the work of works, the acceptable sacrifice. This alone is man's real business in the world and the justification of his existence. Meaning, the appalling immensity, as he calls it, of the physical universe might seem impenetrable to the human mind. But it is possible nevertheless. And even more so, it is the destiny of the human being, of the human species, to enter it, to be enlightened by it. And he also mentions an acceptable sacrifice. That is one of Aurobindo's greatest terms, in my opinion, an acceptable sacrifice. Wow. It is a sacrifice that we have to suffer in order to fulfill our role and destiny. Yet, this is acceptable because of its usefulness to the whole. Acceptable, moreover, means both that it is possible to accept it, but also that it is not ideal, that there's no point complaining about it because we cannot change it anyway, but it is nothing to cheer or write home about. It is merely acceptable. And it has to be accepted even to be able to move on, almost like a childhood trauma. And every human being who manages to glimpse the infinite and sacrifice his or her individuality and his or her pain to it makes it easier for others to follow. That's an important part of the whole mechanic. And thus at some point fulfill the destiny of the whole humanity. Someone always has to go first, and for them it's more difficult. The truth of all things is self-conscious existence, he writes. The same everywhere in all things, in all times and even beyond time, and aware of itself behind all these phenomena, by whose most intense vibrations of activity, or by whose largest totality, it can never be entirely expressed or in any way limited. Meaning, we are representations of it, of the whole. But we merely represent it, not limit it or exhaust it. It is not part of us, we are part of it. And thus we have access if we let it. It is not that we have to act in this world as masters or leaders, but we are involved as catalysts for the benefit of the whole. And the method is by intuition. and starts with knowing thyself. Know thyself, the ancient Greek doctrine also. It exists independently of its parts and aspects, and yet it manifests itself through and by multiple centers of consciousness, especially human beings. We are also some of these multiple centers of consciousness. The Vedic seers called this connection Satchit Ananda, the highest form of consciousness accessible to be experienced by us. And this Satchit Ananda, truth consciousness bliss, or existence consciousness bliss, as it is often translated, is the unknown omnipresent thing the human consciousness is looking for and longing for. The universe as a whole is an appearance of it, and the individuals are also appearances of it, and their interaction is also part of it. The journey towards it is full of veils, but it wants to be unveiled. It wants to be unveiled by us. And human evolution has to progress further to grasp this more fully, for the mind as it is now is not enough. But until then, we can use the mind as a laborer. Okay, maybe that's a sign. The mind is a laborer and everything collapses. Anyway, we can use the mind as a laborer. The mind is not all bad. The mind cannot experience divine joy, but it can want it, strive for it, just as it strives for survival and safety. The Dutch sage and philosopher Spinoza, by the way, also came to this conclusion, that this desire for finding, merging and uniting with the divine, for this is the meaning of yoga, is the highest expression of the urge to survive. It is the same desire. The desire to survive and the desire to reunite with consciousness is one and the same, although this desire for enlightenment is its highest manifestation. And not only individually, but collectively. Spinoza saw it exactly the same way. And also, like the Bodhisattva in Buddhism, every awakened soul helps others automatically, actively or passively, as a teacher or just by having walked the journey as a pioneer, as an example that it is possible. And we know many such examples, just not very many, but it is possible. The universe and us are essentially the same. The universe is a diffusion of all and everything in space-time, as he writes, and the human individual is a concentration of all and everything in space-time. Many teachers like Tony Parsons, for example, have also described the human being as a concentration, a focus. This focus can be a distraction and a misguiding, or it can be an inspiration and a guide. Because in the end, it is not the human being realizing the universe, but the other way around, the universe realizing itself by means of the human being. We are given an ego, which is at first an obstacle, a hurdle to jump. But it is also part of life. And life is our lifeline, our central theme, our leitmotif. Just as mind can seize upon matter and create technology, it can also seize upon life and consciousness and start its own transformation. And human beings that we are, we strive for totality. Light as well as darkness. On the one hand, infinity, omniscience, omnipotence, immortality, freedom, love, beauty. And on the other hand, also error, inconscience, weakness, inertia, grief, pain, and even evil. And not knowing why this is so, why there is evil, is part of the whole process of self-awakening and transformation. This initial ignorance and confusion is somehow part of the process of evolution of consciousness. Just as a baby or a small child has a certain amount of worldly naivete. Again, to believe that there is no higher purpose is lazy. And to believe that this charade is just a trickster illusion is also lazy. Because it is limited and because it stops you from further investigation. Remember, Jets further. Right? Never stop. Always check if and how you can go even further. Never assume that where you arrived at is the end, is the highest truth. To the contrary, we can actually assume that the highest truth is so far away and even not possible to grasp by a human being, and that even its highest approximation is always higher than we can imagine. All these confusions and fears are just starters and side dishes, not the main dish. There is a deeper harmony of the world and in the world. Initially invisible and hidden, but there is a price to pay first to be allowed to see it and experience it. But ask yourself, is this price really higher than constantly reliving the same old suffering you already know? We human beings are not the only aspects of the Absolute who can get transmuted. Others as well, like death and evil and error, will change as well over time, but in a way and method and time span that is beyond our comprehension and beyond our approval. Doesn't need our approval. We are not really in charge here. For some reason, what we perceive as suffering and evil are still necessary tools or processes. It is not some fundamental flaw of creation, even if it seems so to us. And to actively participate in this process, we must at some point leave the areas where the mind likes to dwell, as Aurobindo writes, to tempt the vast and obscure, unfathomable depths of consciousness. Not just stay on the clear surface, but to identify ourselves with states of beings that are not our own. What does it mean? It means we too have to delve into higher and lower realms than what is normal and familiar to us. And not just wonderful ones, but also scary ones. If we really want to get to know the whole truth, it's a bit like the Odyssey, like Ulysses or Hercules' journey. Or many other of these ancient epics like Gilgamesh and so on. Yeah, we have to leave the areas where the mind likes to dwell and where we feel comfortable. Because this is for sure not the highest truth. It's just a habit and a self-imposed limitation. And being on this journey, on this uncomfortable journey, leads us deeper into the laws and intricacies of the ego. The three monotheistic religions, for example, even speak of a fall of mankind, a fall out of paradise, a deviation from pure consciousness. Did they write about the ego? What is this fall? And how can we rise again? Or was there a fall at all? It is very difficult for us to imagine a life without ego, and even more so a humanity without ego. The next chapter deals with the ego and its dualities, its dual principles. That's it for today. Thank you very much to all my Patreons. That means a lot. Thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing the videos with your friends. And see you soon with the next chapter, chapter 7, the ego and its dualities.